program starts in 5 minutes. This program starts in 2 minutes. program starts now.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarvani welcoming you to the Hyderabad Runners weekly webinar series Beyond the Track. Thanks for joining us today. Hyderabad Runners, since its inception, has made its mission to create active lifestyles and make running as the preferred form of fitness activity. Hyderabad Runners has been doing this through the many of its local running groups and mentors all over the city and have been supporting running groups outside Hyderabad too. Couch to 5K for the newbies, outdoor kits for the little ones, Train and Shine fitness programs, annual University of Hyderabad club runs, and our flagship event, Airtel Hyderabad Marathon, which is Hyderabad's only full marathon event, are a few of our core activities, apart from reaching out to various stakeholders and advocating the idea of active lifestyles through talks, local runs, yoga, etc. As we are getting accustomed to the new normal, it's more important that we continue to be cautious and keep ourselves and our families healthy and safe. We need to follow all the hygiene and distancing guidelines issued by the local authorities. We at Hyderabad Runners wish you all a long and healthy life ahead. As part of our initiatives to keep you constantly aware and educated in these uncertain times, we bring you Beyond the Track, a 1-hour live webinar series of conversations with some of the highly distinguished experts from running and related sports field to help you all equip yourselves with both knowledge as well as practical training. In this 14th edition of Beyond the Track, we are happy to connect you to Phil Gregory, a physical therapist who's been working on biomechanics of running. Let me quickly remind you all to please be patient just in case we run into any network issues. We'll try to make this as smooth as possible. Also, we have already received the questions that we need to ask, and we request the others to please post your questions in the comment section of this video, and we'll get them answered to the best of our ability. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Hemant Puderaju, an active member of Hyderabad Runners, who's a well-known surgical oncologist in the city, to introduce and welcome our speaker for today. Over to you, Doc.
Thanks, Arvani. Hello, fellow runners. A warm welcome to today's session. It's indeed a privilege to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Phil Gregory. Dr. Phil is a staff physical therapist at the Furman University, Greenville, South Carolina. He is a doctorate, a PhD in physical therapy from the Medical University of South Carolina, which he completed in 2009. He did his bachelor's from Virginia Tech in 2006 with human nutrition, food, and exercise as majors. He currently works at the Furman Institute of Running and Scientific Training, FIRST first, and on biomechanics of running and injury prevention. His advanced credentials are he's a board certified orthopedic clinical specialist and a certified strength and conditioning specialist. Before coming to Furman, he had a 5-year stint at McLeod Sports Medicine Center. His areas of clinical interest are orthopedic injuries, spinal dysfunction, sports injury rehabilitation, and evaluation and fabrication of custom orthotics. Apart from this, Dr. Phil possesses extensive experience in the functional analysis of functional movement and movement and running, and he's worked with a range of runners with varied abilities, right from weekend warriors to national champions to Olympic trial qualifiers. He himself is a runner for the last 20 years, and he's raced everything from 1 mile to 50 miles. And interestingly, his running history is very interesting that he started running in high school to impress a girl, but looks like he ended up falling in love and marrying the sport instead. He especially enjoys trail running, and as a new dad, of late he logs lots of miles with his young daughter in the stroller. Dr. Phil, please join us. Welcome, and all yours, please take over.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Hemant. And to start with, I just want to thank you guys for giving me the chance to talk with you about the work we do at Furman University around running biomechanics and working with runners. Bear with me a second. I'm going to pull up a couple of slides for what we're going to talk about today. All right, so to get into what we're talking about today, first of all, why do we look at running form? What can be gained from addressing this? Second, what is the ideal running form? Is there a model or a template that we should all be working towards? Or is it something that even really matters as it relates to performance or to our running? Next, we'll just discuss specifically what we're talking about and what we're looking at when we do video analysis or gait analysis, and what we're looking at when we talk about running form. And really my primary goal for this discussion, and what I hope we can take away from this today, is that you'll be able to look at your own form and understand the specifics and some of the tendencies that you may have that may help you improve your performance, or that may be causing some injuries or some issues that you're having with your own running. So hopefully that you can do some of this yourself once we go through the discussion today. And then lastly, we'll finish with discussing some key actions that you can take to address that, and to address what we see on a video analysis or with a biomechanical analysis. So first of all, why do we look at this? From a performance perspective, so much of run training is focused on developing the cardiovascular system. There's tons of discussion about how many miles to run, how fast to run, how long intervals should be, how long rest breaks should be. However, there are other components of your musculoskeletal system and your nervous system that also get developed with training. I like to use the analogy of a car, and your cardiovascular system is the engine. But there are a whole lot of other components to that car. And to continue this analogy, your musculoskeletal system is the chassis or the body of the car, and your neuromuscular system really is the electrical or the computer system of the car. And for peak performance, all of these areas need to be developed. If your cardiovascular system is overdeveloped, it's like putting a muscle engine in a beat up little car. You can only be able to go so far for so long. The other area that we consider is from an injury treatment and prevention perspective. And getting injured athletes back to running, we can use these tools to offload irritated tissue or address patterns of movement that may have developed from an injury or may have caused an injury. And we can also make changes to running form to more effectively distribute load or to decrease stress on a weaker or an injured area. So to begin with, what is the ideal running form? I love these two comparison pictures. On the left of the slide here is Ryan Hall. Some of you may be familiar with him, but he's an American marathoner who's run 2 hours and 4 minutes at the Boston Marathon. And to watch him run is to see poetry in motion. It is absolutely beautiful. On the right is Priska Jeptu. She's a Kenyan marathoner who's run about 2 hours, 20 minutes at the London Marathon. She also has a silver medal from the Olympics. And to look at that picture and to watch her run really, from a clinical perspective, looks somewhat painful. But really, we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can make her look more fluid or try to fit her into a specific mold, that she'll perform better. Obviously by her performance, she is maximizing everything that she can do. The point is that there's really no perfect way to run. This is a factor of your individual body, your foot structure, the alignment of your legs, the flexibility of your muscles, the strength of your muscles. What we're looking to do is to simply maximize what your body is able to do, to go faster, to go farther, and to run with less pain. So let's get started with what we're looking at. Essentially, we simply want to look for symmetry and smoothness of movement. In doing this, we specifically want to look at a view from the back of the runner, but also from the side of the runner. Running occurs in a forward direction, and we want to ensure that there isn't any excessive or unnecessary movement in and out or side to side. We also generally want to see what's going on with posture and where the foot is landing relative to the rest of the body. As a final note on this, as you're doing this at home or with your running partners, I want to highlight that you should probably warm up a little bit first and then kind of choose a pace that feels comfortable for you. Any runner that's over 30 probably realizes that those first few minutes as they get going really aren't as smooth as they are once they're warmed up and 10 minutes into a workout. So warm up, and then then it's when you're ready to take a look at this. So how do we do this? And looking at running form, we'll start from the ground up. Beginning at the feet, we look at how much movement occurs when the foot is on the ground. Does it hit the ground and stay relatively stable, or does the foot continue to collapse in as the body moves forward and the body moves over the foot? Simply, we want to see just a relatively vertical heel. Looking at the back of the shoe, does that heel stay straight up and down, or does it continue to move inwards through the running stride? The other thing we look at is at the feet is with the width of the step. Watching people run, I like to imagine that there's a thin line on the ground where the right foot lands just on one side of that line, while the left foot lands just on the left side of that line. Moving up from the feet, looking at the knees, what we look for here is that the knees stay facing forward. I like to use the analogy of flashlights to demonstrate this point. And if you imagine that you have flashlights taped to each kneecap, we want those light beams to remain facing forward and not crossing over as you go through the running stride. And then the hips here are pretty simple to look at, but really one of the key things that we consider in looking at a runner from the rear. And essentially we're trying to determine if they remain level. When one foot hits the ground, is the runner able to stabilize and keep those hips level? Or do the hips tend to drop on one side or another? And then lastly, in looking at posture, we want to know if the upper body is balanced, or does the runner shift from one side to another? And then once we've looked at the rear view, we'll move into the side view. Again, we'll start from the ground up, and the first thing we look at here is where the foot contacts the ground relative to the body. We'll talk a little bit later about shoes, barefoot running, and heel striking versus forefoot striking, which have all gotten a lot of popular press over the years. But for now, what we really want to know is where the foot lands underneath the body, and we want the foot to land just in front of the body's center of gravity. That's essentially just below the hips. The position of the shin is really a simple measure to look at to make sure the foot is underneath the center of gravity. If the shin is vertical when the foot first hits the ground, then the foot is landing underneath the body and where we want it to. If the shin is inclined back, then the foot is contacting the ground a little bit further out in front of the body than is ideal. And then from there, we look at how much the knees bend. And essentially, we're really just making sure that there's relative symmetry here. And then lastly, we look at how far the leg is able to extend behind the body when you push off the ground. If the thigh remains vertical, then we want to work on some flexibility or some strength to be able to extend the leg and for a little bit more powerful push off, to be able to get that leg a little bit further behind the body as you push off the ground and go forward. So before we look at some of these videos and look at what we do in the lab, I want to talk a little bit about a few options that are available to do some of this type of analysis. In the lab, we use a program that's on the slide here called Qualisys, which is a 3D computerized system, which essentially allows us to build an avatar of the runner and analyze specific angles of the body or the body segments as they go through the running motion. It just lets us get very specific about what we're looking at. Coach's Eye, also on the slide here, is an app that I use a lot in the clinic, but it's really one that anybody can use. It uses a camera from your phone or a tablet and allows you to draw lines and measure angles of the running stride. But really, at the end of the day, I want to highlight that this can be a pretty simple process. All you really need is a phone camera or a camera from a tablet that allows you to maybe play back video or maybe do a little bit of slow motion video. And you can really do most of what we're able to do in the lab. So moving on into the actual analysis part of things, I just want to briefly display an example of what we do in the lab. And I'm going to try to switch screens here, if I may, for just a moment. And I'm going to share a different screen here with you. So this is a little bit of what we do in the lab here. This is a runner who has been to one of our retreats, and she's been gracious enough to allow us to use her data. But we can see using the program on the bottom, we have just a video of her running on the treadmill. Above that, it builds a skeleton model of her running, and we can see, just quickly looking at her arm swing and looking at the movement of the hips, how that mirrors what she's doing on the treadmill. But then it allows us to take measurements regarding cadence, regarding how long her foot's on the ground, how much up and down movement she has, and then even getting more specific, it gives us specific measures about things like posture. Here we can see how far forward her trunk is leaning as she goes through the running stride. I'll scroll down a bit. We can see how much her shoulders rotate through the running stride, how much side to side movement the hips go through. But again, this isn't all necessary for you to be able to do this at home. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and we're actually going to look at a couple of videos that some runners from your club shared with us. All right, so first is Raghu Lakakula, who's been a runner for about 2 years. I'm just going to let this video play for a moment. And again, with this video, we want to start from the ground up. The first thing we notice, and this is a pretty good frame to catch right here, as we look at his right heel when it's on the ground, we notice that his feet are nice and stable, that if we were to draw a vertical line through the back of his heel, it stays nice and vertical through the stride. I'm going to let this play a bit more, and if we look at where his feet are landing, we draw a line kind of between there. There's a nice width of his stride. Birds have some pretty good form there too. Moving up to his knees, I'll let this play a little bit more, but what I want to point out here, again, remembering that analogy of the flashlights, is he does a pretty good job of keeping those knees facing forward. And if I were to get really picky and he were having some issues potentially with that right knee, there's a little bit of outward movement when his foot first hits the ground to when his body moves over that leg. But really, if he's not having issues, that's not something I'm concerned about. And again, that's me just being a little bit picky rather than that necessarily being a problem. And then moving up to his hips, again, we imagine that there's a level there at his waistline, and he keeps those hips nice and level. There's not much tipping side to side there. So next, I'm going to move on to Saurav Sharma, who's been running for about a year. Now remember, we're going to start from the ground up. And here we can see that there's a bit more pronation through his feet than we saw with Raghu. This is a little bit more pronounced on that right side. You know, again, if I were to draw a line through his shoe, I'll see if I can catch a little bit better frame to look at here. But if we watch particularly that right foot, that heel moves in a little bit more than we saw in the previous video. You know, looking at his stride width, we see that he's not crossing over. And as we move up to his knees, I'll let this play a little bit more, but we see that they stay facing forward. I'm going to back us up a little bit so we can see this a bit more. So again, we see that his knees stay nicely facing forward. As we move up towards his hips, there is a little bit of tilting of that hip, particularly when his right foot's on the ground. The left side of his hip drops a little bit. And to me, that says that there's just a little bit more weakness on that right side through those hip muscles. And also I'll let this play a bit, but hopefully you can see that kind of side to side tilting through the hips. And then also looking at his posture, there's a little bit of extra side to side motion there. So in his case, you know, exercises potentially like side planks would help him control his posture and be a little bit more stable when he's landing, particularly on that right side. So as we move to a side view here, we can see that, I'll let this play in a moment, but what I want you to look at is that there's good symmetry in the bend of his knees, that they're both going through about an equal amount of bend. And then as he lands, I'm going to try to take it back just a little bit. I'm going to be picky because I want you guys to see where this foot's landing underneath his body to demonstrate what we're talking about. Let's see. I think that's a good frame there. You know, again, to talk about where the center of gravity is, if we were to draw a line essentially here, basically right at the center of his hips, you know, down to the ground, that's where his center of gravity is. And his foot is doing a nice job of landing just in front of that. Again, the measure we can also look at there is that shin nice and vertical, which we see there. But the other thing I want to point out here is looking at how far back that thigh, I think the left one is a good one to watch with this video, is extending as he pushes off the ground. So we can see how the thigh doesn't extend quite past vertical. So in this case, I think just getting him a little bit stronger through the hips and doing some strides, which is a drill that we'll talk about later, can really make a difference to improving his performance. So next, we're going to look at another runner, Ashish Kumar. And he's a runner who's been running for about a year. We're going to look at that side view. So again, we'll start from the ground up. This is a good frame to look at, because again, we want to see where the foot contacts the ground relative to the center of gravity. So again, if we imagine that his center of gravity is right at the center of his hips, drawing a line straight down, that foot's a little bit out in front of him. Again, we can see that as well with the shin being just past vertical. So in his case, I'd like to see him land with the foot a little bit closer underneath him. We can talk about some drills and a little bit of ways to do that. But hopefully from this frame, you can see what I'm trying to illustrate here. And then as he goes back and forth, we see how his hips tip a little bit from side to side. So again, imagining that there's a level at his belt line or at his waist and trying to keep that parallel to the ground. There's a little bit of side to side tilting there. So I think in his case, if we can work on getting him a little bit more flexibility through his hips and getting him a little bit stronger, he could have a much more stable and more powerful stride. And then lastly, we'll look at a few views of Anubhav Karmakar. And here's the case where I want to be somewhat cautious, as it's obvious, by the fact that he's such a talented runner, that in some cases there's a potential to do more harm than good if we try to do too much. I understand he's run about a 2:40 marathon at New York City, which is quite impressive. But he has some good positions that I want to highlight that kind of demonstrate what we've been talking about. So here we can see how this back leg, his right leg here, as he goes to push off the ground, is nicely extended, and that thigh is well past vertical. I'm going to bring him forward a little bit more. I think this will be a good frame to look at here. So again, his thigh is well past vertical, his right thigh as it extends, but also as we look at where he's coming into the ground, where that left leg is about to make contact with the ground, he has a relatively vertical shin there. So even though it may look like that leg is way out in front of his center of gravity, again, his center of gravity being just below the hips, that shin is still nice and vertical, which is the position that we want to see there. Also, just looking at his overall posture, he's nice and tall. He has a little bit of a forward lean, but that forward lean is really coming through the whole body. He's not just bent over at the trunk there. So this really looks very good, and hopefully illustrates a couple of positions that we're talking about. And I'm going to go to a different clip of him, which I believe is in a race video. And we can see how there's a little bit of extra movement from it through his trunk, through his shoulders. But I'm guessing that this is towards the end of a race, which, judging by the fact that he's soaking wet and quite sweaty, is probably a pretty fair assessment. So that extra movement probably has a bit more to do with fatigue. But the other thing we can see here, and I'll make a note of that before we play the video again, is that if we watch his feet, they stay pointing straight ahead. There's not much side-to-side movement. His knees stay pointing, facing forward, and the hips stay really level. So I'll let this play through a little bit more. So again, looking at his form, this is a case where I would really hesitate to do much of anything, particularly without talking to him personally and addressing what his goals may be, because there's potentially to do more harm than good. And really, if we just generally watch his stride, he looks very smooth. So I'm going to come out of these videos and go back to some slides here. So now hopefully you have a little bit of an idea of what to look at with your own running. And I want to talk about a little bit about what to do with that information now. It's like, okay, now we know what we're looking at, what we're seeing. How do we make some changes or how do we address that? But first of all, I want to address something that I think we've probably all been dealing with, whether it's you've been running for a long time and have been coming off an injury, or all of us with this quote new normal and not being able to get out as much with the closures and cancellations from coronavirus. And the first point is a couple of baselines to consider as you're building back to your training, whether you're coming off from injury, you've been hurt for a little while, or you just haven't been running for a few weeks, or in some cases a few months. So if it's the case that you've been out for just a week or two and maybe had a niggle or a little bit of ache or pain that you just wanted to take some time off, as you come back, start at about 75% of that load that you were doing the last week or two of your training, and then build back over the next week or two. If it's the case that you've been off for 2 to 6 weeks or so, assume it's going to take about as long to come back as you took time off. So if you were off for about a month, then it's going to take about a month to build your fitness and strength back to where you were before you took time off. And then lastly, if you've been out for 6 weeks or so, assume it's going to take about twice as long to build back. And again, to highlight the point I made earlier about your running form being like a car, your cardiovascular system, your cardiovascular fitness comes back very, very quickly. But your musculoskeletal system and your nervous system are a little bit slower to adapt. So be cautious just as you're returning back to form. And it's also important to consider, regardless of your level of ability, that everything you do affects your training. It's not just the time you spend putting in miles, but it's also really what you do the rest of the day. If you spend your workday sitting at a desk, those hours are going to affect the flexibility that you have in your hips and potentially maybe affect your posture. And that's going to carry over to your ability to extend the leg behind you through your running stride or to maintain a nice tall posture with your running. So it's important to consider that you may want to include some simple stretching with things such as, I'm a huge fan of yoga poses like warrior or pigeon, to loosen those tissues up and to stretch that tightness back out. And the other point is that if you aren't getting much sleep at night, that affects your ability to recover and to put in more miles as well. If we have two equal athletes, the one who pays attention to their rest, to the nutrition, is going to be able to handle a lot more training than the athlete that may only be getting 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night. The other point that I really want to highlight, particularly for those of us that where running is not our job, is that your body doesn't differentiate different kinds of stress. We think of training as a good type of stress since it helps us to be healthier and improve our fitness. But if you're dealing with stress from work, from life, family, finances, anything else, that affects your body's ability to recover and perform as well. So as we consider what to do with training, it's not just the miles to run or the paces to go or how often to run. Also consider what else you may be dealing with the rest of your life and how that affects your ability to recover and perform. So let's look at some actual specifics of running. And first, I want to highlight that running is a skill. Running is a very simple sport. You only need shoes in the open road, but the movement itself of running is a skill. Dr. H mentioned that I had a little girl, she's almost 2, and it's been fascinating to watch her progress from rolling over to standing to walking, and she's finally started to run a little bit. She's trying to figure it out. But along each step of the way, she practices different components of that movement or of those movements to develop mastery over them so that she can progress to the next level. And as part of that, her brain and her muscles are figuring out how to coordinate all those different patterns. Running is no different. And really, this is no different than what we want to do as runners, is practice the skill of running. To use a separate analogy, if you're trying to play the piano, you wouldn't get very good if you only practice once or twice a week. It's when we practice frequently that we develop those movement patterns that make us more efficient. I would much rather have a runner do 4 to 5 runs per week of a shorter distance than 1 to 2 runs per week of longer distances, because they're just getting that much more practice of the skill of running. The second point here is probably one of the biggest issues I deal with in the clinic and working with runners, is that we tend to run the same distances at the same paces day after day. Simply running at a variety of paces over a variety of different terrains really can go a long way to making us better runners. And it's not only that these paces train different aspects of our cardiovascular system, they also challenge the musculoskeletal system and the nervous system to make us better. It takes a much different movement strategy to run a 7-minute mile pace than it does a 10-minute mile pace. I apologize, I'm using the imperial system rather than metric system, but your body naturally makes those changes as you mix up your training at different paces or over a variety of terrain. And I want to make a quick note about shoes here. I suspect we'll get some questions at the end, but I want to address it for a moment. That shoes get a lot of attention because it's the one piece of equipment that we can buy that affects our running. However, shoes are really simply a tool. There's been a ton of research looking at injury prevention and shoe wear and different types. But at the end of the day, the data and the research point to the most important factors, both from injury prevention and performance, being that the shoes fit and that they're comfortable. Additionally, barefoot running has recently been a trend with the claim that it improves your form and helps you land with the foot closer to your center of gravity. But this is something that can be easily trained with shoes or in shoes or with just some simple drills we'll talk about in a moment. Additionally, barefoot running doesn't necessarily reduce your risk of injury. It just changes the type of injuries that tend to occur. And then these last 2 points are ones I want to make sure you're not neglecting, as they tend to take a back seat for runners, since mostly we just want to go for a run. And the first is strength training. I've included a few ideas that I think are very effective for runners, as they've been shown not only to reduce injury, but to improve performance. Additionally, strength training is a critical part of maintaining just a general healthy lifestyle. And I've included squat and deadlift exercises, hip abduction, so an exercise where you're just laying on your side and raising a leg up to the ceiling, and then calf raises, just where you're standing up and potentially standing on one foot and raising your heel off the ground, really until you just get tired. The other point here is drills, and these are the tools that we really use to refine the running stride. For those that are having knee or ankle pain, increasing cadence by 5% can help reduce that pain. I mentioned earlier with some of the videos looking at where the foot lands relative to your body. if you're having an issue with that, increasing your cadence a bit can help you get that foot a little bit more underneath you or get that foot closer to you. And again, 180 isn't necessarily the goal. I know that gets talked about in a lot of running magazines or in a few running books. That's not really the ideal. But if you're having, issues with knee pain, ankle pain, or have that shin angle that's inclined a little bit backwards, increasing your cadence a little bit can help to address that. Strides are another drill that really I use a lot in the clinic because they're effective at teaching posture, and they're effective at teaching that powerful hip extension. So pushing that leg all the way behind your body as you're running. Strides are something simple where you can either do it during a run or at the end of a run, where you do a few repetitions, maybe 4 to 8 times, where you're running not quite all out, but almost trying to sprint for a distance of maybe 60 to 80 meters, and just paying attention to just essentially trying to go as fast as you can. Backwards running is another drill that I use a lot to work on teaching that hip extension and to work on teaching landing with your foot underneath your body. And really that's what it sounds like, just trying to run backwards. And the next are A-skips. This is a drill that I use a lot to teach runners to land with their foot underneath the body. This is simply a skip where you focus on landing with that foot underneath you. And I've included here as well an idea for a YouTube video that I like a lot that has a good variety of some common other running drills. Those previous 4 are probably ones that I use the most, but that YouTube video has a good variety of drills. And really, I'd encourage you to look at some of those drills and simply go out and play with them. At the end of the day, this is really just about getting you moving better. And anything that you can do, whether it's strength training or some fun footwork drills, will all work together to not only make you a better runner, but a better athlete. So with that, I'll finish my presentation, and I think we're going to open up and take a few questions.
Yeah, that was really a very insightful talk, Dr. Phil. Crisp, clear, concise, and quite basic, I should say, with touching upon the points where we should actually go up and stress up a little bit. Be a 24-hour athlete is something which it's a very nice line. I mean, your emphasis that sleep, nutrition, stress, everything actually affects training. How often do we hear that, and how infrequently we practice it? This is a very, very simple concept that you put in. Be a 24-hour athlete. I think that one line summarizes most of your presentation. I just love that.
Thank you.
If you're ready, can we take a few questions?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. So this is a question from Pradeep. He says that most runners maintain biomechanical efficiency for the first 70 to 80% of the run of a marathon, but it goes for a toss in the final miles. How can such runners work on the last 20-30%?
Oh goodness, that is a somewhat tough question to answer. And I don't know if really anybody has found that solution. And that's part of what I think makes specifically the marathon such a tricky event. Because as it relates to those last, say 10 kilometers or so, it's a combination of everything. As we start to fatigue, we don't have the same energy to maintain our form, to maintain our posture, simply because you've been out there for several hours at a time. So to begin with, I think the first point is probably to make sure that you're doing enough long runs so that you have the energy to go that distance. I think the second thing that's probably going to be helpful is that you're including some type of strength training as part of your training. So like I mentioned, squats, deadlifts, exercises like step ups to just improve your overall leg strength so that when you get tired, you're able to maintain that form. And then lastly is the nutrition aspect of it as well, making sure you're going into the event, having fueled for the previous few days, the previous week really, appropriately to have the most energy available for that distance, and that as you go into the event that you're doing something in the event, whether that's through taking gels or sports drinks or things like bananas to have the fuel so that when you hit that 20-mile point and start to get tired, that you have the fuel tank available to finish the rest of that race.
Thank you. There's a question from Sandeep. He asks, should one strive for the perfect running gait or improve their own way of running?
Goodness. Foot strike has gotten a lot of coverage in the literature recently, and probably a lot of it's due from the popularity of that book, Born to Run. But what we've discovered from the research is really that where you land on your foot doesn't make that much of a difference. So whether that's a heel strike, landing with the foot flat, or landing with the forefoot doesn't really make a difference from the perspective of injury prevention or performance. What really matters, regardless of if you're barefoot or in shoes, is that foot's landing underneath your center of gravity. So again, that shin is relatively vertical. And that's something that can be done in shoes, out of shoes. That's really what is important. What position the foot's in doesn't make that much of a difference. In fact, a lot of times in the clinic, I'll teach runners just to try to relax that lower leg. Because a lot of times some folks are trying to intentionally do something different that may not be ideal and really may be more tiring than beneficial.
Another interesting question from Nitesh is, what should be the frequency of doing the running drills? Should it be done before every run?
That's a great question. To begin with, really, it's probably a question of how much time you have. I think at a minimum, I would say 2 to 3 times a week. And it doesn't have to be anything that's really extensive. Something that takes maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes at most is more than sufficient. And if you're doing it 2 to 3 times a week, that's frequent enough that you're going to get some improvements to your posture and to your running form and to your athleticism. A lot of times I'll work with runners who are trying to fit that into their training. And I think the best recommendation is just to do it as part of your run. So, go through whatever warm up or stretching routine you generally like. Maybe go jog for 5 minutes along your normal route. Once those 5 minutes are up, keep going along that route, but take the next few minutes to do some of those drills as you continue traveling down. And then once you've done some drills, then continue on with the rest of your run. So it's not that you're necessarily having to stop and take that time to go back and forth along the road before you actually get into your workout. You can do it just as part of your workout. Saying that, some of the elite runners that I work with are doing drills every day. But again, these are folks that have 2-3 hours a day to train, and that's pretty much what they're doing for their livelihood as well. And I realize that we're not all in that situation, but I think at least twice a week would be effective to get some really good carryover.
There's a question from Karthik. He asked, what are your thoughts on stride entropy? How does it help develop stride length over a period of time? Stride entropy and stride length.
So just to be clear, the question was, what are the thoughts about stride length?
What are your thoughts on stride entropy? How does it help develop stride length over a period of time?
Yep. So strides as a drill really are simply effective at teaching you that powerful push off. So it develops the neuromuscular coordination for that movement pattern. And the reason I like them is that a lot of us really tend to, again, just run at those same speeds day after day. but adding some faster paced work can improve your body's efficiency and the coordination. And doing that takes us through a different range of motion, takes us through more range of motion to teach the leg to extend behind you.
And in your experience, which is probably the single weakest muscle group or the single most important group to focus on? With most runners being recreational runners who have jobs, sit most of the time, which do you think is one muscle which is usually weak and needs to be strengthened on a general basis? Is it the core, the glutes, the quads?
I think it's all comes down to the glutes, really, because those are the muscles that do several things. They help us to control that tilt of the pelvis. So again, if we imagine my hand being the pelvis, controlling that side to side motion, the glutes help to control that. The glutes help to keep the hips forward in the running stride. So in those that we see that tend to slouch down or to sit in the stride, getting the glutes stronger helps get those hips forward. And then also they play an important role in extending the leg behind you. So as we talked about in Anubhav's video, how effective he is at getting that thigh behind him, that takes a very powerful glute muscle to extend there. So if that's where you want to focus on one, that's where I would pay attention to. And that really, again, those exercises that we talked about, the squats, the deadlifts, from a yoga perspective, bridges is a pretty effective pose or drill to develop that. But I would start with the glutes.
Another interesting question, Subramanian. He says cadence seems to be an overrated running dynamic as compared to stride length. What are your thoughts on it?
Yep, I totally agree. A lot of publicity focused around initially that 180 strides per minute. The data that was from, though, was from a pretty small study of 5K runners running a championship meet. So these guys were elite performers going very, very fast, and their average cadence was around 180. Now that's not all of us, and we're not all running at that kind of pace. And you probably notice that as you go faster, your cadence naturally increases. So again, 180 isn't necessarily the ideal. The two things that I look at are, as it comes to cadence, are, is it at least over 164? There's some research data, not much, but a little bit, looking at running injury, and 164 kind of tends to be the cutoff as a risk factor for developing an injury. So if I'm working with a runner that has a cadence below 164, I'd absolutely want to get them a little bit higher, above that threshold. And then the other case where I'm going to address cadence is if somebody's having a specific injury or issues with their stride. So, again, if they're having issues with kneecap pain, maybe Achilles tendonitis, if we can increase that cadence by 5% or so over their baseline, that, based on research, tends to help relieve some of that pain. But otherwise, there really is no ideal number. And again, more as far as the stride length goes, there's no ideal number of how long a stride should be. That's very individual based on how fast you're going, how tall you are. But what we are concerned about is, is that foot landing underneath your center of gravity, and is that shin vertical?
Yeah. Another interesting question from Veda is, what is the importance of arm movements in running form, and what to watch out for to improve running efficiency?
Yeah, that's a great question. As it relates to arm movement, I like to use the analogy of horse racing. And as it comes to your running stride, the arms are really the jockey riding the horse. The arms are just relaxed. They're going along with the movement. And really the horse is doing all the work. So as it relates to your running, as long as you keep those arms relaxed, your shoulders, not up towards your ears, but down and comfortable. The rest I don't get too specific about. The one thing I do pay attention to is making sure that the arms aren't crossing over. So occasionally you'll see folks that as they run, it's almost like they're shadow boxing. Those arms are moving back and forth. I don't like the arms crossing over the center of the body, because that's just more rotation that your core and hip muscles have to control. But other than that, keep the arms relaxed.
Yeah. And one last question here. We have lots of questions. I think we'll have to go offline and then those questions get them answered later. The last question for the day is, what do you say on the necessity of shoe change for every 800 kilometers of training mileage?
Just to clarify, what are the is regarding shoe changes and injury and
shoe change for training at 800 kilometers, any particular metric?
Yeah, so one thing that some research has shown is that changing shoes with a variety of shoes can be effective at reducing injury. And what that means is basically, you just have one more pair of shoes. Personally, I have a pair of shoes that I use on easy days, and I have a different pair that I may use for long runs and for workouts. But that's not really necessary. Even just having two pairs of the same shoe can be effective. And the reason why is that shoe material tends to break down over a period of miles or a period of months. Typically the recommendation is to change shoes every 300 to 500 months or so, miles, or every 6 months to a year. But if you are able to rotate different types of shoes, then that can not only help the shoes last a little bit longer, but the way that they wear are a little bit different, and it's going to give a little bit different stress to your body with each run. So, again, as we talked about the importance of running different paces and running over different terrains, that little bit of variety can be effective for injury prevention.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. I request Deepak, my co-runner, to take over. Deepak?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hemant, for the Q&A facilitation. Friends, it was yet another informative and inspiring 1 hour. We hope you enjoyed attending the event as much as we did in organizing it. Few key points from today's talk: different body types, different running form, and different modifications for each body type. Everything we do will affect our training, and be a 24-hour athlete, sleep, nutrition, work, and stress will all affect our training. Running as a skill which can be improved with a regular practice. Running at different pace and in different terrain will definitely help us to improve as a runner. We have also learned about the importance of stunt training and the drills, which will help us in the overall running performance. Thank you, Dr. Phil, for these valuable inputs and insight. Our deepest gratitude for taking the time out and sharing your experience and learning with us. And to our audience, thank you for choosing to spend time with us. Please feel free to ask any more questions you have for Dr. Phil in the comment section. We will work it out to get your answers. The recording of this event will be available on our Hyderabad Running Facebook page and on the Airtel Hyderabad Marathon YouTube page. Please come back and watch again and share it on your social media profiles and to others whom you think can get benefited. Hashtag Hyderabad Runners and Beyond the Track. Before we wind up, we would request all members to follow government advisories to be safe and healthy, considering the number of cases are increasing rapidly. We'll be back next week with another expert and another interesting topic for you. Just as you marked Sunday morning, 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. for our SLR, the Sunday long run, week after week, you can also mark your Saturday evenings, 7:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. for Beyond the Track webinars. We hope to see you every Saturday. Until then, this is Deepak Malviya from Hyderabad Runners, signing off. Stay safe, stay healthy, and bye-bye.